When Daniel and his wife, Claire, decided to buy their first house, they were filled with hope and excitement. They had saved for years, worked tirelessly, and finally found a place that felt like the foundation of their future. The house was perfect, charming, cozy, and nestled in a lovely suburban neighborhood called Maplewood Lane. It had that quintessential small-town feel that made them both sigh with relief. They could already picture their lives there, weekends spent gardening, evening walks around the block, and cozy nights in front of the fireplace. Everything about the place screamed peace and tranquility. It was exactly the kind of neighborhood they had always dreamed of: manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and just enough space between the houses to give each family privacy without feeling isolated. The house was in a great school district, and everything they needed, grocery stores, parks, and even some fantastic local coffee shops, was within walking distance. It felt like they had won the lottery. They packed up their old apartment, ready to start this new chapter of their lives. Moving day came and went in a blur of boxes, movers, and excitement. The first few days were spent settling in, trying to figure out the layout of the house, and deciding where all their furniture would go. They were finally getting used to the little quirks of the place, the creaky floorboards, the way the kitchen light flickered when you turned it on, but all of that felt like part of the charm. It wasn't until they started setting up their cable and internet that things began to feel off. Like many people these days, Daniel and Claire had bundled their TV, internet, and phone service. Claire had been in charge of arranging the service before they moved, so Daniel didn't think much of it. He was in the middle of unpacking boxes when he saw Claire on the phone with the cable company, a frown slowly forming on her face. "They're saying there's some issue with the HOA," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Apparently, we can't keep our cable box in that spot we talked about because it's considered unsightly." Daniel stared at her for a moment, half listening. "Unsightly?" he asked, completely thrown off by the notion. "It's a cable box." "Since when is a cable box unsightly?" He thought maybe it was some misunderstanding. The cable box had been installed professionally, sitting on a small pedestal next to the house, which seemed like the most reasonable place for it. It wasn't blocking anyone's view or on anyone's property but theirs. But apparently, that wasn't the problem. "Something about HOA rules," Claire continued, looking at the paperwork in her hands. "They said we can't have it there, and that's why the cable company won't proceed with the installation unless we move it. They're even saying we need permission for these kinds of setups from the HOA. "HOA," Daniel repeated slowly, processing the information. What the heck is an HOA? He had heard of them before, of course. Everyone had. But growing up in the city, he had never had to deal with an HOA. They were one of those things you read about in the news, typically with some negative story about people being overly controlling about their neighbor's property. It wasn't something he expected to have to confront so soon, especially not after moving into a place that seemed as laid back as Maplewood Lane. "Let's just call them," Daniel suggested, brushing it off as one of those minor headaches that come with owning a home. He didn't want to let it ruin their excitement, but the whole thing felt weird. A couple of days later, they received a formal notice from the HOA. The letter was signed by the president, Margaret Hargrove, and it outlined the rules about property maintenance and aesthetic standards. The letter was polite but firm, explaining that they needed to comply with the HOA's guidelines to avoid fines and potential penalties. Among the rules listed, one in particular stood out: no visible cables or wires on the exterior of homes without prior approval from the HOA board. It was a lot to process, especially after moving in and trying to figure out where everything fit in their new home. But Daniel and Claire decided to follow the procedure. If that's what they needed to do to avoid fines, they'd do it. So, Daniel filled out the paperwork for a request for approval to keep the cable installation in place. It seemed like a formality, so he didn't expect any trouble. The idea that anyone could have a problem with a cable box seemed absurd. He had lived in apartments where cable setups were everywhere, and no one cared about a box being outside. But it wasn't that simple. After submitting the request, Daniel received a response within a few days, one that caught him completely off guard. The HOA, led by Margaret, denied their request, claiming the setup wasn't in line with the community's aesthetic values. Apparently, the position of the cable box was deemed unsightly by their standards. In fact, they insisted that the entire area needed to be re-landscaped, a move that seemed a little extreme for such a minor issue. Daniel remembered reading that letter, holding it in his hands, and feeling an unexpected rush of frustration. Who was this Margaret person, and why was she so invested in how a cable box looked? He thought about how he had just spent all this money and time to move into this place, and now he was being told how to position his own cable line. This was supposed to be a peaceful neighborhood, not some HOA nightmare. That's when the tension between them and the HOA started to build. Daniel decided to go to one of the HOA meetings, mostly out of curiosity and, to be honest, a little bit of stubbornness. He wanted to see who was behind these bizarre rules. He was fully expecting to find a group of stuffy, overzealous neighbors who were way too concerned about the small details of life. And boy, was he right. When he walked into that first meeting, he could immediately tell there was something off about Margaret. She had this sharp, no-nonsense attitude and made it clear that she was the one in charge of the neighborhood. The meeting was full of complaints about everything: lawn care, paint colors, even the occasional stray cat. Daniel wasn't sure if it was her tone or just her general vibe, but Margaret seemed less concerned about maintaining a pleasant community and more interested in enforcing every little rule she could think of. When Daniel brought up the cable situation, he was met with eye rolls from some of the other members, but Margaret didn't back down. She insisted that it was a matter of community standards and that if he didn't comply, he'd be fined. In a calm but firm voice, she stated that he had to relocate the cable line within a week, or there would be consequences. It was at that moment that Daniel realized this wasn't just about a cable box. It was about power, and it seemed Margaret was all too eager to remind everyone who was in charge. After the meeting, things only got worse. Daniel had hoped that Margaret and the HOA board would calm down, but instead, they seemed to double down. Daniel and Claire spent the next few days discussing what to do. They didn't want to be the troublemakers on the block, but the way Margaret was handling this felt completely out of proportion to the issue. A simple cable box was not worth this much drama, right? Unfortunately, Daniel soon realized that he was wrong to think it was a small issue. Margaret's response to his refusal to move the cable was swift and brutal. The very next day, he received another letter from the HOA, this time with a much sterner tone. It was almost like the first letter had been a warning, and this one was the real deal. The letter stated that if he didn't comply with their demands, they would be forced to impose fines and even legal action if the cable remained in its current position. This time, the letter made it clear that there was no room for negotiation. According to Margaret, the cable box was an unsightly nuisance that violated HOA bylaws. It also listed several fines for every day Daniel failed to comply. That's when the frustration really started to build up for Daniel. He had read through the HOA rules before they moved in, but honestly, you didn't expect something like this to come up. It was one thing to make sure everyone kept their lawn in order, but now it seemed like they wanted to control every aspect of their property, down to where they placed their cable box. He couldn't understand why this was such a big deal. To top it off, there wasn't even a clear explanation in the letter about how exactly he should move the cable box to make it acceptable. There were no guidelines, just the vague suggestion that it needed to be hidden better. Daniel spent the next few hours pacing around the house, trying to figure out what his options were. Claire, who had been more diplomatic up until that point, was equally frustrated. "This is ridiculous," she said, holding the letter in her hands. "There's no way we're the only ones with cable boxes out here." She was right. Daniel looked around the neighborhood and realized that almost every house on their block had some kind of cable or satellite dish set up outside. Some of them had boxes even bigger than theirs. Yet none of the other neighbors seemed to have received letters. It didn't seem fair that they were being singled out, especially when there were no clear written rules about cable installations in the neighborhood guidelines. Daniel decided to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't going to just move the cable box without a fight. He'd paid for this service, and he had every right to install it in a way that was functional for them. They couldn't be the only ones dealing with Margaret's control issues, right? He called the HOA office, hoping to get some clarification on what exactly needed to be done. When he finally got someone on the phone, it turned out to be Margaret herself. She was cordial, but Daniel could tell by her voice that she wasn't interested in hearing anything he had to say. "Mr. Carter," she began, sounding overly polite. "As I mentioned in the letter, the position of your cable box is in violation of our aesthetic guidelines. I'm sure you understand how important it is to maintain the uniformity and appearance of our neighborhood." Daniel was taken aback by how matter-of-fact she sounded. "Uniformity?" he asked, trying to keep his cool. It's just a cable box, and it's not like it's in the middle of the front yard or anything. She didn't seem to care. That's beside the point. We've had several complaints about the appearance of your property. I've already had someone sent out to take a look, and we've decided that it must be moved. You'll need to submit a formal request if you want to try again. Daniel almost lost it at that moment. A formal request? He had already submitted one. It felt like she was just making up rules on the fly to get them to back down. The more she spoke, the more Daniel realized this wasn't about the cable box at all. It was about control. It was about enforcing her will over the rest of them. You've already sent me a letter, Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. You know what the situation is. Why do I need to jump through more hoops? Well, Margaret said in a condescending tone, we're just trying to ensure that everyone follows the rules. You'll understand once you've lived here for a little longer. Daniel couldn't believe it. Understand, he repeated, now feeling his frustration boil over. I don't think you understand how ridiculous this all is. But she didn't seem to care. After a few more minutes of back and forth, Daniel realized this conversation wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't going to listen to reason. This wasn't about fixing a minor inconvenience. This was about asserting authority over something she had no right to control. That evening, Daniel and Claire sat down to discuss their next steps. Daniel didn't want to escalate things too quickly, but this felt like a fight he wasn't ready to lose. They had a right to live in their home without someone telling them where to put their cable box. Daniel was ready to dig his heels in and stand up to Margaret and her unreasonable demands. But he knew that wouldn't be enough. If he was going to win this battle, he needed to get the rest of the neighborhood on his side. At that point, it became clear that this wasn't just a matter of a cable box anymore. The HOA's interference felt invasive, like they were overstepping their bounds. Daniel realized that if they didn't stand up now, things could get worse. They couldn't let this petty power struggle define their experience in this new neighborhood. It was time to find out just how far Margaret and the HOA were willing to go to enforce their rules. The situation with the HOA escalated quickly, but Daniel never imagined it would get to the point where they would actually send someone to physically cut off the cable. After his conversation with Margaret, he figured he'd have some time to think things through and maybe find a solution that didn't involve a big confrontation. But a few days later, he got a call from Claire. Daniel, you need to come home. Something weird is going on, she said, her voice sounding concerned. Daniel could hear the stress in her voice, and it sent an immediate wave of panic through him. He rushed back home, unsure of what to expect, but the sight that greeted him when he pulled into the driveway was far worse than anything he could have imagined. There, in the front yard, was the cable box, lying in pieces on the ground, with the cable itself cut cleanly in half. The technician who had come to fix the issue had clearly done his job and gone far beyond what was necessary. It looked like they had just sliced through the cable without a second thought, leaving it hanging limply like a broken piece of string. Daniel stood there for a moment, completely frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Did they really just do this? He muttered to himself, trying to stay calm. Claire was standing on the porch, arms crossed, looking equally stunned. I don't know, Daniel. I don't know. It doesn't make sense. I didn't even hear anything, she said, her voice trembling. Daniel looked at the cut end of the cable again. There were no signs of any technician or service vehicle around, which was odd because the HOA had specifically told them that a contractor would be handling the removal. It was almost as if Margaret had taken matters into her own hands and sent someone without notifying them first. The more Daniel stared at the cable, the more he realized something else. It wasn't just any cable. The line running through their yard didn't serve only their house. It extended beyond their property line and connected to several other houses in the neighborhood. This wasn't just their internet line. It was providing service to at least half the block. Daniel couldn't believe it at first. How had he never noticed this before? The cable snaked along the fence, just below the surface, and he hadn't realized that it branched out to other homes. But now it was obvious. There were a few homes further down the block with similar lines running along their fences. It was one of those things that was so easy to overlook, but now it was glaringly clear. Daniel, what's going on? What are we supposed to do? Claire asked, looking at the severed cable in disbelief. Daniel was still in shock, but his mind was racing. He immediately pulled out his phone and started trying to reach the cable company, hoping they could help fix this quickly. After a few minutes of being on hold, he managed to get through to a representative. Sir, I understand that there's been an issue with your cable service. Can you describe the problem? The agent asked, her voice calm and professional. Daniel explained what had happened, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sir, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The line you're referring to doesn't just service your property. It's connected to multiple houses in your neighborhood. If that cable is cut, everyone in the block is going to lose internet service. The words hit Daniel like a ton of bricks. He felt the color drain from his face as he realized just how badly Margaret and her crew had screwed up. It wasn't just about them anymore. The entire neighborhood had just lost access to their internet because of a petty dispute over a cable box. Are you telling me that this line connects to everyone on the block? Daniel asked, trying to make sure he was hearing her correctly. Yes, that's correct. It appears the line is providing internet access to several homes. If it's cut, all those customers are going to be affected. Daniel could feel his blood start to boil. He thought about all the people on their street, families, elderly residents, and remote workers who depended on that internet. Margaret had made a mess of everything without even realizing what she was doing. She thought she was just removing an unsightly cable, but instead, she had cut off a vital service for everyone around them. As if things weren't bad enough, the thought of all the annoyed neighbors who would now be without internet made Daniel's stomach turn. People were going to start knocking on his door any minute, and Margaret, well, she wasn't going to be the one to fix this. That's for sure. Daniel spent the next hour on the phone with the cable company, trying to arrange for a technician to come out and repair the damage. They assured him that someone would be sent out as soon as possible, but in the meantime, there was nothing he could do to get the service back up and running. At that point, Daniel realized that this was no longer just about his cable box or the HOA's rules. This was about how far Margaret was willing to go to enforce her ridiculous standards without any thought to the consequences. She had no idea what she'd just done, and Daniel was left holding the bag. Daniel and Claire decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to figure out what to do next. As they strolled down the street, Daniel noticed a few of their neighbors stepping out of their houses, clearly frustrated and confused by the sudden lack of internet. One of them, Mr. Thompson, an older guy who lived 3 doors down, came up to Daniel and asked, "Hey, Daniel, what happened to the internet? It's down all of a sudden." Daniel felt his heart sink. This was going to get ugly fast. The next few hours were a whirlwind. Daniel could feel the pressure mounting as neighbors started showing up at their house, all of them asking the same question: what happened to the internet? One by one, they knocked on their door, some with frustrated looks, others with genuine confusion. Daniel had no idea how to explain this mess to them. How could he tell them that Margaret's overzealous attempt to enforce HOA rules had just left the entire block without internet? Daniel stepped outside, hoping to address the growing crowd. Claire stood behind him, watching nervously. The scene felt surreal, almost like something out of a bad sitcom. Daniel had never thought he'd be the center of an HOA drama that affected so many people. "Daniel, do you know what's going on?" Mrs. Rivera, one of their neighbors, asked. "We've all lost connection, and I can't even work from home anymore." "I'm so sorry, everyone," Daniel said, trying to keep calm. "It's not just you guys. Apparently, the cable line running to my house isn't just for my internet. It connects to other homes as well. The HOA sent someone to cut it, thinking it was just my service, and now, well, now everyone's without internet." Mrs. Rivera's eyes widened. "What do you mean? Are you telling me we've all been using your internet this whole time?" "Not exactly," Daniel said, scratching his head. "But somehow, our cable runs to most of the houses on the block. I had no idea it was set up like that. The technician just cut it, and now we're all stuck." That explanation didn't seem to make things better. In fact, it only seemed to make everyone more upset. A few of the neighbors, guys like Dave, who worked from home as a freelance designer, and Sarah, who was trying to manage an online business, were clearly pissed. "Are you telling me that Margaret just cut off our internet like that, without even checking with anyone?" Dave asked, raising his voice. "Honestly, it sounds like Margaret doesn't care about the rest of us," Daniel replied. "I tried explaining everything to her, but she was more concerned about the unsightly cable running along my fence than about the fact that this is a community service. I'm guessing she didn't even think about how far the cable stretches or what it's connected to." The air felt thick with frustration. The longer Daniel stood there explaining the situation, the more agitated people seemed to become. He could hear Sarah muttering under her breath, This is ridiculous. I have clients I need to meet with, and now I can't even get a video call to work because of some HOA nonsense. And it wasn't just the workers and business owners who were affected. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly lady who lived 2 houses down, came up to Daniel, looking genuinely worried. "Daniel, dear, I can't even watch my shows. How am I supposed to pass the time now?" It was clear that this wasn't just a matter of minor inconvenience. This had disrupted people's lives from work to leisure. The lack of internet was having a ripple effect throughout the neighborhood. Daniel started to feel guilty. He hadn't signed up for this drama, but now he felt like it was his responsibility to fix it. "Listen, everyone, I'm going to do everything I can to get this fixed," Daniel said, trying to keep the peace. "I've already called the cable company. They're sending someone out to fix the line, but it'll take a little while. In the meantime, if you need help or want to discuss how to handle this, we can meet up and figure something out." At that point, it seemed like a good idea to get everyone on the same page. They decided to meet in the cul-de-sac at the center of the neighborhood, so everyone could air their grievances and maybe come up with a plan. Daniel knew that it wasn't just about getting the cable fixed. It was about making sure Margaret understood the impact her actions had on all of them. And frankly, it was about making sure this didn't happen again. As the group gathered in the street later that afternoon, there was a palpable tension in the air. People were speaking in hushed voices, shaking their heads in disbelief. But as Daniel looked around, he realized something. Everyone was angry, sure, but they were also united. In that moment, the whole neighborhood felt like one big team, frustrated but determined to get things back on track. "Look, we can't let her get away with this," Dave said, his tone firm. "The HOA is supposed to protect our interests, not cause us headaches. We need to hold Margaret accountable." Daniel nodded. "I agree, but we have to be smart about it. We're not going to solve this by just yelling at her. We need a plan, and we need to act quickly before this goes any further." As the conversation progressed, more people chimed in with ideas. It became clear that the frustration they were all feeling wasn't just about the internet. It was about how Margaret had overstepped her bounds, taken matters into her own hands, and disrupted the entire neighborhood without so much as a second thought. This wasn't just an issue with a cable line anymore. It was about power, control, and fairness. "I think we need to contact the HOA and make sure they understand how serious this is," Sarah said, pacing back and forth. "Margaret might have the power right now, but she's crossed a line. We're the ones who pay for the HOA fees. We deserve to be heard." Daniel agreed, and soon they all settled on a plan. They would draft a letter to the HOA, explain the situation in detail, and demand that Margaret fix what she'd broken. If she refused to cooperate, they would take further action. Daniel could feel the energy shift in the group. It wasn't just frustration anymore, it was determination. But as the meeting broke up and everyone started heading back to their houses, one thought kept running through Daniel's mind. This wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But it was clear now, they were all in this together. And together, they were going to make sure Margaret understood the consequences of her actions. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret wasn't just clueless. She was taking advantage of her position. So he started digging. He reached out to a few neighbors who had been around longer and discovered that Margaret had been pushing unnecessary improvements for months, all while collecting extra fees from residents for things that weren't even required. When Daniel checked the HOA's financial records, he found invoices for upgrades that were way overpriced, and some even seemed completely fabricated. The tipping point came when Daniel got hold of an email showing that Margaret had been pocketing the extra charges from the cable services. It was a clear case of embezzlement, and Daniel knew this had to be exposed. He contacted a local journalist, Michelle, who specialized in investigating HOA corruption. Together, they gathered everything they needed to expose Margaret. The news hit like wildfire. Margaret was arrested for embezzlement, and the HOA was forced to revamp its entire structure without her influence. The new board started making real changes, focusing on transparency and fairness. Daniel and a few other neighbors stepped up to help, creating a cooperative internet network for the block. Everyone chipped in, and soon they had a stable, community-supported system. The neighborhood began to heal, and trust was restored. What started as a chaotic, frustrating mess turned into a victory for everyone. As Margaret was left behind, the community moved forward stronger than Eve. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.